is Lacey Sheldon. I am a librarian at Macintosh Memorial Library in Viroqua, Wisconsin. And I'm wanting to welcome you today to a very special program, Journeys to Palestine, with Bob Goonin and Becky Comeau. They're Vernon County residents beyond borders. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bob and Becky. They've been living in this area for quite a few decades, and they recently traveled to Palestine in the autumn of 2019, and they had that timed with the olive harvest, which we will get to hear all about. And also, interestingly, this is right before the very unfortunate COVID pandemic had broken out and swept across the world. So they had been traveling internationally right before this happened. So we'll get to hear a lot more from Bob and Becky. And on a personal note, thank you both so much for coming back to tell us about your trip again. Bob and Becky and I did this program about a year ago, and I just absolutely love it. I'm so glad that you're here to share with us again today, folks. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
So Goonin, we traveled to Palestine with a group called Eyewitness Palestine. They basically took us around. They had relationships on the ground. It gave us, I think, 10 days, very full days, meeting people, seeing a lot of areas on the West Bank. I'll show you a map in just a moment, as well as within Israel. So it's very, very great experience. I am Jewish, and I think that is part of the motivation for going. I have some sense of responsibility for what's happening on the ground there, and wanted to see for ourselves and be able to talk about that with people. And I'll have more to say about myself as we go through the slides and talk about the experience.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. So I learned a great deal in the process. I highly recommend Eyewitness Palestine. They do online tours right now. They're really amazing and good people, lots of good contacts. And they go into different parts of the country and different themes. So it's very interesting.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start sharing. All right, so we wanted to give people a little bit of orientation, geographic orientation first. So in the kind of the gold color, that's the state of Israel. In the lighter yellow color is the West Bank, which is part of Palestine, where we spent most of our time. It's called the West Bank because it's on the west bank of the Jordan River, which runs here between the boundary of Palestine and to the east. This is Jordan. It's on the Mediterranean Sea with Egypt to the south, Syria here just to the north and east, and Lebanon up to the north. So that's kind of situationally the part of the world where we're talking about. And just to give you a sense of size, so state of Israel is about the same size as the state of New Jersey, and actually a very similar population, just over 8 million people. So we found when we were traveling around that we didn't need to go a great distance in order to see a lot of the West Bank as well as part of Israel. But I will say it took quite a while because there is a lot of traffic there, especially in the urban areas.
And checkpoints.
And checkpoints and some fairly narrow roads. So, all right, I'm gonna Beck kind of take it over from here for a bit.
Okay, so the theme of our trip, it was in November, and that's the season of the olive harvest. So that was the theme of our trip. And these are olive trees in the foreground of the picture. they're a Mediterranean tree that they can live for like 1,000 or more, maybe 3,000 years. Some of them are very, very old. And they are, they're the part of the core of the culture, the cuisine, and the economics in Palestine. They're just like really a big part of it. The oil is sacred and nutritious, and the wood is useful, and its branch is a symbol of peace and abundance. And in Palestine, for those people, the olive tree is a symbol of the people's connection to the land. So it's like a hugely meaningful tree. And there are literally millions of them. They're actually like kind of like cows around Wisconsin. They're just like everywhere. In the field, in the city, along the hillsides. And they're harvested in the fall. So we can move on to the next slide. And we stayed with a family in a village near the city of Jenin. So this is the Abu Fadi family. And Abu Fadi is the elder in the center of the picture with the blue shirt. So this is the male segment of the family. And the women were, kind of around from time to time, but much less visible in the public spaces. But they were like super friendly and really wanted to interact with us and very loving toward each other. They're very warm people toward each other and toward other people.
It's very physical culture. You can kind of see the kids were so excited to see us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, go ahead. So we visited with them that evening in their little living room, gathered around their tables and chatted, and they were anxious to share their stories with us. Again, the women were largely not present, but they came in and out and were friendly and curious. So this is a rural village, a more conservative aspect of the culture, and there are degrees of that within the country. So not everyone is as conservative. So yes, next picture. And so they were anxious to share their stories and their phone photos and videos of a wedding, and there's a Google app that does translation, so that was helpful. But they spoke some English. Of course, we did not speak any Arabic. So this was a friendly encounter. And behind them, you can see in this picture some beautiful Palestinian crafts and artistry. Okay, next one. And they served us a meal of cucumbers and hummus with olive oil. And it was just delicious. Lots of pitas. We had lots of pitas and hummus.
And lots of falafel.
Lots of falafel. Yes. How can I forget? Delicious. Okay, next. And then in the morning, we loaded up into the cart to go to harvest olives. So they live in the village, and this is typical. It's not like the American style where the homestead is on the land. The people live in a village. They're clustered together, and then their land is surrounding that village. So, and some of it's shared in common, but a lot of it is family owned and used by various families. So we jumped in the cart and went off to their little olive orchard.
This was really fun, by the way. We're being pulled by a tractor, and the streets through the village are like really narrow and curvy.
Yes, so that was fun. Okay, so this is the family harvesting olives, and they're using very traditional methods with a stick. And a little saw, they lop off the branches and put them on the ground. And the women, as you can see, do participate fully in the work. And then the next step, next slide, is that you pull by hand. You can pull the olives off of the branches, and then they get just put onto a tarp on the ground and eventually into bags. So that was really, really fun. I enjoyed that. Okay, go. And this is Abu Fadi again. He is a certifier for the organic company called Canaan Fair Trade, which we'll see more about them in a minute. But he keeps records about all of the different farms and the amounts of olives that come from each farm and whether they're fair trade, organic, etc. So he was showing us his record keeping. And then we stopped by and delivered some bags of olives to the local oil press. And I think we have one more photo. Yes, and this is their press. So, it's pretty good size. But they gave us a quart of olive oil. It was like fresh off the press. It was like warm and very lovely. But we later had to figure out how to get it on the airplane to go home. But
they gave it to us in a
it was just
liter jar with no lid on it.
A jar, no cover. Kind of on the fly, but it was wonderful. Very fresh.
Oops, sorry. All right, so I'm going to talk just briefly. This is the Canaan Fair Trade that Becky mentioned. You can see the building behind here is a very modern, recently built building and production facility. Kind of, I guess it was interesting to see this. It's it was good to see manufacturing there. These are bins with the olives that are being brought, and again, they're brought from the farmers to Canaan for processing, and also Canaan does sales and distribution. Quite impressed at how modern the production facility is. You can see this is fairly automated equipment. There is the olive press at the front end with conveyors that bring the olives in. And then at the back end of the process are the, kind of the filling of the bottles and the containers.
It's a very lovely tiles of art behind. Yeah, you can see. Yep. Yeah. They're just beautiful mosaics.
So we were given a tour of the facility. This young woman is the manager of the operation, including the retail store. So she gave us the tour. Very, again, nice steel tanks. They control this paperwork she's referring to. They know when the olive oil that's in the tanks was produced, so they can track that. And they make a pretty wide array of products. One thing that was interesting was their olive oil goes into Dr. Bronner's soap. So they are, I think, the primary provider of the olive oil in Dr. Bronner's. If you ever use Dr. Bronner's, you'll know now where the oil comes from. I get to talk now. That's, the homestay and the olive harvest were just very enjoyable experience. Maybe the way that Palestine used to be, in a sense. And things have changed a lot. And so now we have to get into some of what's happening there and some of the history as well. So in this left-hand panel, this is the way that Palestine used to be, the green representing Palestinian owned land, managed land, farms. The white areas were Jewish settlements, Jewish immigrants who came and lived in Palestine. And this is prior to 1947. And I think it's important to note that Palestinians and Jews lived and farmed side by side in peace for generations. All right, there is a history here that is very different from what we know today. This second panel This area was a British colony, and in 1947, Britain decided to withdraw, and they put forward a plan. This is again post-World War II, post-Holocaust, okay? And they put forward a plan which went through the UN and was approved there, which created a state of Israel. And you see the original proposal in white, and then the areas in green were the part of the land that was for the Palestinians. Quite a contrast from how things were in terms of the people actually living on the land prior to 1947. One thing about that UN plan is that no one asked the Palestinians who were living on that land. They had no rights or input to that decision, nor did the Arab countries living around them. And that led to a war in 47 and 48. We'll talk about that a little more in a moment as far as what was happening within this area, within Palestine, and what is now Israel. But Israel won that war, and the effect of their winning the war is that the area that became the state of Israel in white is larger than it was according to the plan that was passed in the United Nations. And the area in green, which is what we know to be the West Bank and Gaza, in 1967, there was yet another war, which again, Israel won, and they took military control of the West Bank and Gaza. And today, what we've seen is the result over time of that military occupation is that Palestinian land in green has now been fragmented, and it's been reduced 60% of the West Bank, and we'll talk about areas A, B, and C in a few minutes. 60% of the West Bank is now totally under Israeli control. And the 40% that is Palestinian is again very fragmented, and we'll talk about how and why that is.
Do you want to mention Gaza, just where it is?
Yeah, and this is Gaza here on the Mediterranean. Gaza has a whole history, but basically they are living under a blockade where the people cannot leave, and no supplies of any kind come into Gaza without Israeli permission. We did not have the opportunity to go to Gaza. However, Eyewitness Palestine does do virtual tours of Gaza, and that would be one way for people to, have some kind of a firsthand feel for what's going on there. So we were taken on a tour of a town within Palestine, a town that's called Lifta. And Lifta is one of the more than 500 villages that were destroyed as part of that war in 1947-48. And what was happening within the area within Palestine is that there were Jewish militias that were conducting, I would say you could call it a terror campaign. There were towns being leveled. There was some level of violence against the people, and people fled. And that's an old story, right? So they fled from their homes. We're talking about more than 750,000 Palestinians who were forced off their land. Many of them went to the area which is now Gaza. Some went to Lebanon, some to Jordan, some to refugee camps that, and we'll talk about that later, that we visited within the West Bank. This gentleman here is from an Israeli human rights organization called Zokrot. And their mission is to teach people, specifically Israelis and American Jews, about this history with Lifta and what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, which is all of their people being forced to flee and become refugees. And so here's my note about my personal background. My parents lived through the Holocaust. I'm kind of a first generation post-Holocaust Jew. Grew up with, hearing the stories, very, very strong emotional tie within our family and many, many families, both in America and elsewhere. The view of Israel as a refuge and a homeland for Jews. But the thing that no one ever talks about is the fact that there were 750,000 Palestinians that were forced off that land. There are still many Palestinians living within the state of Israel. 20% of the population of Israel is Palestinian. So this really was essentially, so why force all those people out? It's essentially an ethnic cleansing campaign. Because if you're going to have a Jewish state, you have to have a majority Jewish population. And that was not the case on the ground. So for me, it's been the last few years, kind of a coming to terms, not only with the military occupation, which, I had found appalling for a long time because of the human rights violation there, but just really coming to terms with the fact that the state of Israel itself was essentially a theft of land. And we refer to, it's kind of a concept called settler colonialism, which is a process of colonialism where you displace an indigenous population with a settler population. And a lot of it is about land. It's about land and the natural resources. And there are a lot of connections to be seen between what happened here in Palestine and what happened in our own country with the displacement of the Native American population. So one of the, we have this sign here because Lifta is the Palestinian name for this village. It's been renamed En Neftoa, which is a Hebrew name. And this is done throughout Palestine, that Palestinian names for things were renamed with biblical names, Hebrew names. And that's part of the general concept is one of erasure. And, you take these people's land and then you kind of erase the origins of what happened. In Lifta, there is a mosque and there's some this picture is this beautiful architecture. Ancient architecture going back centuries, which unfortunately we saw that there was some defacing of the mosque by probably by Orthodox Jewish settlers who come there. It's a sense kind of almost a park-like setting now. This is a view of the ruins of Lifta. Actually, there were several thousand people that lived here. It was a thriving Palestinian village before it was demolished in 47, 48. Again, one of like 513 towns that were demolished. All right, so I mentioned briefly earlier the areas that are known as Area A, B, and C. And these areas were defined as part of the Oslo Accord in 1995, which was intended to be an interim 5-year agreement leading to a Palestinian state, which never happened. This area in kind of this yellowish area is what's called Area C. And I mentioned this before. This is totally under Israeli control. Palestinians are not free to move in Area C. There are Palestinian farms and settlements that are in Area C, but there are no new farms that are Palestinian that are being added here. Area C is under Israel's military control and also their administrative control. And it's 60% of the West Bank. So how did that come to be? Especially this area near Jordan on the west side of the Jordan River is a military zone, off limits to everyone. Even, we couldn't even approach this area. Then also there was land which was taken as state land. And a lot of that was taken when they passed a law called the absentee law, which said that if the original owners of a certain property were absent for 3 years or more, that property would then become state land of Israel. And this is in combination with the fact that when these 750,000 people were forced off their land and fled their homes, they're not allowed to return. So you have an absentee law that by definition is taking their land because they're not permitted to come back to it. And that's part of settler colonialism too, right? That's how the land, one of the mechanisms for taking the land. And the third thing to mention is that they've created a number of nature preserves, which often are where Palestinian settlements used to be before they were demolished. This area in gray is called Area B. It's under Israeli military control, but under Palestinian Authority administrative control. And then finally, Area A are these cities. They're Palestinian cities. And really what's happening is that the Palestinians are being squeezed off their land and being pushed into these more urban areas. That's the general trend. We'll talk about some of those mechanisms in a minute. This is a view of the kind of a hill overlooking Lifta, which now has an Israeli settlement built on it. And off in the distance,
Up above it.
up above
Yeah,
it.
so
Yeah.
I used to think that settlements were like little tiny, couple like wooden shacks or something. That is a little mini city up there on the top. These are settlements and they're like many, many people.
Yes, and they're many of them are newly built here in the West Bank. You can see this other settlement in the distance. Everywhere we went, there were settlements. There are now over 600,000 Jewish settlers within the West Bank. These settlements are everywhere. This is a view of an Israeli settlement from a Palestinian farm called Tent of Nations, which Beck will talk about more later. Again, the pattern is they're built uphill, looking down on Palestinian towns and villages. This is a Palestinian village here down below. They're a farming culture. So this is an agricultural area. They're often in the valleys. The Israeli settlement is built up above it. And the architecture of the Israeli settlements is very uniform. They have red roofs. They have this kind of cream colored wall. And that's all throughout the West Bank. That's what they look like. So settlements is really, they continue to expand. They've been there, the process has started really in '67. And it's really a strategic thing. It's not just the current Israeli government. It's a long-standing strategic theft of land. Illegal by international law, by the way. So we visited Jerusalem, which is really the center of 3 different religions, very important holy sites to those religions. You can see here the Wailing Wall, which is very important from a Jewish cultural standpoint. The Dome of the Rock here, which is a very important religious site as well. So you have Christianity, you have Islam, you have Judaism, all within this one area. From the same spot I took that photo, I took this photo. And this is a Jewish settlement within the city of Jerusalem, overlooking these holy sites. And in a sense, this is really a provocation, right? This is not one of those beautiful Israeli settlements on the West Bank with new schools and medical clinics and nice roads. They put this settlement here as a kind of a in your face, we can create a settlement wherever we want to. This is a Palestinian market in the old city of Jerusalem. And the settlement up above it, the Jewish settlement up above it, has been known to throw garbage down onto the Palestinian market. And so the people in the market had to put up this protective roofing material so that the garbage wouldn't rain down on them. Just a sense of the conflict and a sort of the aggression, of some of the Jewish settlers. So we also need to talk about the wall, which you may have heard of. Sometimes it may be referred to as the separation wall, but it's a bit of a misnomer, because then you get a sense that, the wall was built and it's just protecting the Jews within Israel from the surrounding area. But the footprint of Israel, based on its 1947-48 boundaries, is here in this yellow with the green line around it. But where the wall was built is what you see in red. And so the wall is entirely built on Palestinian land. And it's got these very odd shapes, right? And the reason for the odd shapes, which feel like almost like our gerrymandered congressional district, is that it was a way to bring in as much land as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. These are often Jewish settlements that are being brought in and essentially annexed, right? Because it's now within the wall. And that's why some people refer to this as an annexation wall, because that's factually what it accomplished. Very imposing. I think, we're talking about 30 feet high in parts. This is the wall. The other thing about the wall is it cuts through Palestinian communities, right? It's on Palestinian land, and it cuts through Palestinian communities. This is Bethlehem. In the background is the University of Bethlehem. In the foreground is part of the town of Bethlehem, where the Palestinians live. Again, this is Area A, right? It's a Palestinian town. The students who used to walk from the town to their university now have to travel a long ways and go through a checkpoint in order to get to their school, which has been very damaging to the school's population. This is a little bit reminiscent of what's happened with the building of expressways in the US going through African American communities. The wall is very imposing. We see it in many different places. That is a guard tower with an armed Israeli soldier. There is resistance to the wall. This is artwork that we saw at that wall in Bethlehem. I want to point out here, we saw consistently artwork that represented basically what we would call the right of return for those 750,000 Palestinians who were forced to flee and become refugees. That one of the key demands in any negotiation about what the future of Palestine-Israel should look like is that people have the right of return. It's like a non-negotiable right. And what happened is when people fled their homes, they took their physical key with them, which was, you know,
Those old style keys.
old style keys, like these are big key. They took the key with them. And so that key has become symbolic of the right of return. And again, we see it in a lot of the artwork, and quite beautifully done. Want to talk a little bit about, these are identification, kind of like passports. And these are really important as far as what you can and cannot do, where you can and cannot travel within this area. This is for Israeli citizens. The middle one is East Jerusalem, which is kind of it's an area where people living there have some of the rights of citizens of Israel, but they do not have political control, and their movement, for example, to the West Bank is restricted. And then you have an identification that you are on the West Bank or Gaza, which means a much more limited movement permitted. So one of the things that has happened, and this relates to those identification cards, you know, how does that work? There are many examples where transportation is segregated. This is a map of bus lines that connect Israel with certain areas of the West Bank, like the old city of Jerusalem, like Bethlehem, sites that people, you know, are major tourist attractions. These bus lines are for Israelis only. If you're Palestinian, you cannot get onto these bus lines. They are segregated, and they are, what's the word? Enforced, I guess would be the word. As another example of transportation that is segregated is the way the road system works. When we landed in Tel Aviv airport, we took a bus from there to Jerusalem. And when we passed the border from Israel into the West Bank, into Jerusalem, we hit a checkpoint. And beyond that checkpoint, Palestinians were not permitted to use that road. Only Israelis, or you know, we were on a tour bus with an Israeli plate. And these roads in gold, if you can see them, and Highway 443 that we were on is one of them. These are off limits to Palestinians. Okay, and that's within the West Bank. And there are roads where side by side, you may have a road which is only available to Jewish settlers on the West Bank, and often a smaller, less developed road nearby that's only available, only usable for Palestinians. And so we're seeing this level of segregation. Typically, like these roads in white that you see, Israelis and Jewish settlers have full access to those. Palestinians also do, but these roads in red are managed and limited by the Israeli military. So how do they control who goes where? There are different license plates. This one in front with the green on a white background are Palestinian plates. This car back here with black on yellow is an Israeli plate. And depending on which plate you have, it's enforced as to which roads you can use. We talked earlier about the fragmentation of the Palestinian land, Area B within the West Bank. And what fragments that land are a combination of Jewish settlements and the segregated roads that connect those Jewish settlements to each other, and then back to the main Israel of the 1948 boundary. So transportation, a very important way in which segregation is enforced. This is a checkpoint. We went through this checkpoint on our tour bus. It was like going through a toll, you know, in the US, it's like no big deal. All these cars have Israeli plates. Okay, for a Palestinian to cross into Israel is a nightmare. It's a series of checkpoints. Some of them are at certain times of day extremely crowded. Little known fact, there are roughly 70,000 Palestinians who cross into Israel every day because they work in Israel. Many of them doing construction or other manual or agricultural work, and they have to pass through a permit, a checkpoint, and often they will spend hours. And this is pretty typical for what it's like if you're trying to go to Israel and work as a laborer. People have to go in the middle of the morning, early morning, because they have to stand online and pass through the turnstile. If you want to get a really nice view of what this is like, there's a short film called The Present as in a gift. And it's a wonderful film, and it's a story of a Palestinian man and his daughter and having to navigate this type of a checkpoint.
To go shopping for a gift for mom for their anniversary.
Yeah, and what they had to endure. We talked earlier about settler colonialism and pressure on Palestinians to move off their land and into the cities. And water is a really central part of that. The main source of water in the West Bank and also parts of Israel comes from what's referred to as the mountain aquifer. And the mountain aquifer feeds the Jordan River. At the point of the Oslo Accord, so historically, this is what fed the Jordan Valley, this water. The Jordan Valley is like the heartland in terms of farming and agriculture. And so has always been freely available to farms in that area. But it now was captured in the 1967 war. So the mountain aquifer is now under Israeli control. And they negotiated with the Palestinian Authority in 1995 that 71% of that water would be used by Israelis and only 17% by Palestinians, which is very unequal when you think about the population involved. But the reality on the ground today is even worse, which is 87% of the water is used by Israelis, 13% by Palestinians. And what's an important piece of that, and part of the pressure or the squeezing that happens, is that in order to do any kind of drilling of a well, whether it's a new well or deepening an existing well, you have to have a permit. Permit comes through the Israeli Authority. And essentially all permits for Jewish settlements are approved. For Palestinians, it's roughly half. So roughly half of permits for water access are denied, which, if you're in a farming settlement and you're trying to make your living from farming and you are needing to deepen your well, that puts tremendous pressure on you. So we visited in the Jordan Valley a Bedouin tribe, which, historically, culturally have always been nomadic, but they are no longer, they're now restricted. They're not allowed to freely move about in the Jordan Valley. Again, it's an Area C, it's controlled totally by Israel. And so they are being squeezed to move into town, but again, it's a nomadic culture. The water table is declining. This is going down. It's partly climate change. It's partly overconsumption by Jewish agricultural settlements. And so part of the really harsh situation is that when the mountain aquifer was captured and controlled by Israel, Palestinians were given very limited access to it. There's an Israeli state-owned water company called Mikoro, and Mikoro sells water back to Palestinians who need water. So in this Bedouin village in the Jordan Valley, they have to buy water from Mikoro at obviously a very higher price than it took to use the water when it was coming in through the Jordan River. And they then have these tanks. So they'll buy the water. The water company may come by once every week. They have to buy the water and fill up their tank for the coming week. So the water is stolen and now it's sold back to them. This is an example of water infrastructure being built in support of the Jewish agricultural settlements in the West Bank. You can see back here this kind of plush green farm. You know that that's taking a lot of irrigation to support that. And this is the water infrastructure that they've built specifically for that Jewish settlement. We saw a number of different types of Jewish settlement farms in the Jordan Valley. This is an herb farm, which again is, using that water allocation. So this is sort of a summary slide to give you a sense as to the extent of injustice around water. For Israeli settlements, on average per person, per capita, 369 liters of water consumption per day. For citizens of Israel, 300. For Palestinians on the West Bank, 73. Below the World Health Organization minimum. And just to make that concrete, if you take a shower, every minute you're using roughly 10 liters of water. So a person would use their entire allocation of water to take an 8-minute shower in the West Bank. And they're forced into these terrible choices, right? Do I use this water to take a shower and be clean? Do I use this water to cook with? Do I use this water to clean my, my clothes? Very hard choices. And yeah, again, control of water is really a tool. I witnessed did a nice job of preparing us culturally for the visit, because we don't know the culture. And Palestinians are very welcoming and generous, and they'll ask you if you'd like to take a shower. And our guidance from Eyewitness Palestine was politely refused, because you may well be using their entire allotment for the day by taking your shower. So that's the water, and that's how water fits into settler colonialism. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Becky, because we have some Palestinian people that are part of our local. We formed a coalition locally in the La Crosse area called Cooley Region Coalition for Palestinian Rights, and there are several Palestinian folks in that group, and they emphasize a lot that while there is oppression, there is this military occupation, there is the all these people that have been forced off their land. All of that's true, and affects people's day-to-day life. There's also resistance in many different forms, and people that find a way to go about their lives. And so I'm going to turn it to Beck, because you're going to see some of those means of resistance.
Okay. So this is, Bob mentioned Tent of Nations earlier. This is the Tent of Nations vineyard farm. It's about 100 acres. And the Nassar family, has been on this land for a very long time. They have documents going back to the Ottoman Empire, which the fact that they have those documents has allowed them to stay on the land. But it's a constant struggle, and they are not allowed to build infrastructure. Like they have no well and they have no electricity. So imagine running a farm without either electricity or water, pumped water. So they collect water in cisterns, and they have solar panels that create some electricity for them. And again, you can see a settlement across in the background there. They're surrounded by settlements. So even access to the farm is difficult.
Chico.
Go. And this is Mr. Nassar. He was explaining to us their little water collection system and a cistern underground, which is just, that's how they get their water completely. Next slide. So this concrete is part of the water collection system. And then there's cisterns above for holding water. They do a lot of educational activities with children. People from all over the world come here. So they do artwork with and for the children. And it's also a place of healing and therapy for families in the area. You can visit them at tentofnations.org if you'd like to learn more about them. But they're a really resilient family, and they're struggling hard to stay on their land. This is another example of water collection. I think this was back at the Abu Fadi olive orchard. So they try to help me remember this story exactly. At one point, they wanted to get a permit for a well, and they dug a well. And then the soldiers came and filled it in with concrete, destroyed their well. Because they were not, the permit was denied. The permit was denied, but they dug a well anyway because they needed a well. I mean, you need water for farming and living. So now they've done this concrete water collection system. So rain is collected into underground cisterns, and that's all they have to work with. Also not permitted. Not permitted. So they don't know if this will likewise be demolished. And that is what happens a lot with home construction, that people will apply to build a home, and the permit will be denied, and they will build the home anyway because they need it for their family. And then the soldiers will come and they will destroy the home. It's the same dynamic. Okay, so in the midst of all of that, there are several refugee camps within the West Bank. And we visited a couple of them. Dahisha Refugee Camp was established in 1949 from 46 surrounding villages. Go ahead. And this is an example of some of the resilience and resistance of and experiences and trauma that they have. This is a wall with the names of children that were killed during an Israeli massacre in 2014. These children that were massacred. And go ahead to the next slide. This also within the refugee camp is a memorial to a 13-year-old that was shot at this exact spot. Just innocently standing there. This is a tower just behind this view, and so the kid was shot down, and the sign on there says that, you know, his spirit is still here, and he's wondering if the international community will come and help the children with this injustice. So it's a kind of a really moving and moment to understand that an innocent child could be just shot in daylight, broad daylight. Next slide. And in addition to sniper shootings, tear gas is a regular occurrence. This is a little shop right near the refugee camp, and they collect these empty tear gas canisters, and they turn them into metal art, jewelry, and other forms of art. And we did stay overnight in the refugee camp, and it was a lovely experience. But in the middle of the night, we awoke to noises, and it turned out that was tear gas outside, and some of our group could feel it. We were a little bit more enclosed, but they could feel their eyes burning and could smell it. So that's a regular occurrence.
Yeah, we were told, on average that happens maybe once a week. And a lot of what's going on there is that soldiers are coming into the refugee camps because there's someone that has committed, alleged to have committed a crime. And crimes include throwing rocks at soldiers or tanks, which are typically Palestinian youth. And they will come in the middle of the night at gunpoint. They will take these children away from their family. They may be hooded, they may be cuffed, they get taken to interrogation without their family or attorneys present. And they have to go through a military court system for nothing more than being alleged to have thrown a rock. And so that's the dynamic. When they come in the middle of the night to seize someone, they are resisted, and the kids will throw rocks and they'll shoot tear gas, which is what we experienced. They'll take away the kid or kids that they were after. Then they come back the next week because, again, rocks were thrown at them when they came in. And so you have this ongoing, really trauma created with the kids in these camps and elsewhere, in the way they're handled by the military court system.
But we took a walk around the refugee camp even in the evening, and that was like being in a neighborhood. It's a real family kind of place. There were kids and moms and people walking around with grocery bags, and our cohort, Ellie, was enjoying some time with the kids and their bikes here. So within the refugee camp, the people care for each other. It's very densely populated, so everybody knows each other. And actually crime is very, very low because, again, everybody knows each other and knows who done it. And so the scary part is the external forces of occupation with the snipers and the tear gas. So we had a really, really nice experience walking around in the refugee camp. Go to the next slide.
Yeah, just it was so different than I think, maybe a perceived sense that maybe this is going to be scary.
Or not filthy or whatever.
No,
yeah,
it was not at all. It was a wonderful experience, other than the Israeli incursion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this is on the roof of the camp in an educational building. They're doing projects with kids, growing food with using minimal water and experimenting with various types of plants. And you can see in the background is a water barrel, that white water barrel, that's all painted lovely. And beyond that is a security tower with a sniper in it. So it's this really weird scene to look at. And then they told us a story so they have to buy this water again to use in the educational center. But one time, the sniper shot a hole in their water tank, and then they had to replace it all. It's like, why? But that happens. And water is so precious that, it just seems like really unjust, to say the least. Okay, next slide. And this is Mohammed. He's a young father who's also doing education and experimenting with techniques of growing food that are very resilient. So this is what's happening in the midst of all of the difficult things that Bob described, and in the midst of climate change, et cetera, that these people are working on finding ways to live and be happy. And so he said normally his kids feed the fish, but he's feeding fish in that little white tank at the bottom. And then that nutrient-rich water is pumped up to feed the plants that are growing in the pipes along the wall. And he's experimenting with different types of plants. Just a wonderful young father person who's doing lots of good education. And similar education is going on in the Palestinian Institute for Diversity and Sustainability in Bethlehem. And you can go to the next slide. They have an area that they're landscaping and teaching and programming in how to capture water and grow plants in a permaculture way. And we visited another farm that is has been in existence for a very long time, but also now surrounded by problems. They were at one time, they were trying to force them off the land. The Israelis were trying to force them off the land, and he actually got bulldozed. His wife had to, because he was standing on his own land, and the bulldozer came through, and he ended up underground, rescued. So it's like really difficult. But in the midst of that, they have really high mission, and they do lots of educational programming here at Hakaritna Farm as well. And I love their statement of that water, energy, and food are freely available for all humankind when we no longer follow the laws of capital, but rather the logic of nature. So their love of land and nature is very strong. But this is at Hakaritna Farm. You can see the wall, first of all, that's surrounding them. That was part of the bulldozer incident. The wall was being built through his land, encroaching on his land. And then in the background is a pharmaceutical chemical plant that spews lots of chemicals into the air and onto the plants, and it's an organic farm. So it's a very bad situation for the food and the people that live there. And so the family has put up a lot of greenhouses to protect their plants. And they have no water. All of their water is collected water, which is so amazing to me that they can run these like very productive operations without pumped water. And so they really know how to collect it and move it around. And this is outside the city of Ramallah. This is called Suleiman Farm, which means Ladybug Farm. And you can find them on Facebook, which is really fun. And so they run a community supported agriculture farm there. So they supply boxes of food into the city of Ramallah. And it's just a group of young people with, again, a very high mission and high value in creating both food and community.
It was really interesting to visit Ramallah because it is, I didn't know, you think about Palestinian cities, sort of think about them as older and smaller and spread out. Ramallah is a big city, and Ramallah is a thriving city. And again, it's managed by the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian administrators. Yeah, just impression, construction everywhere. It's a growing place.
They had an electric vehicle charging station there.
Too, pretty modern,
Yes, modernized.
in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so this is some of their plants growing inside of the greenhouse at Sleman Farm, young farmer.
So this is our last slide. We thought it is important. So this is still at back at Tent of Nations, and one of the part of their mission has been to educate people, international people, about what's happening with their farm and the efforts to push them off the land. And they've done a lot of, with people coming through. They've had international donors like the solar panels we saw earlier. They also have had a lot of international volunteers to help them with the work. The international connection's really important. The situation on the ground in Palestine continues to worsen. The human rights violations, the expansion of the settlements, it really has become more and more dire. And at the same time, there is the resistance that we've talked about. And also there's a really important international connection, which is the United States provides every year $3.8 billion of military aid to Israel. And that is what funds the military occupation. That is what funds the military court system for Palestinian youth. It is what funds the technology and the surveillance by which they control the Palestinian population. That's our money. That's US taxpayer dollar money that's going for that purpose. And so one of the things that, at the same time, the situation's become harder on the ground, there's been this tremendous growth of the international movement in support of Palestinian rights and Palestinian justice and opposition to the military occupation. It's amazing how much that has grown in the last 20 years. I'm a member of a group called Jewish Voice for Peace, which are mostly American Jews who are opposed to the military occupation and opposed to the way in which the state of Israel was imposed on that indigenous Palestinian population. And it's a very growing, rapidly growing organization. So we have a lot of responsibility for what happens in Israel because it's our money that's funding it. It's our money that props it up. And so one of the things that we push for is that that money be conditioned on the behavior of the Israeli state. Settlement expansion being a very easy thing, that money can be conditioned on the ending of the use of our funds to support the military court system for Palestinian youth is another example. Betty McCollum, a representative from Minnesota, has put forward legislation that basically would prohibit the use of US funding of that military court system for Palestinian children. And then the other international initiative that's become very powerful is called BDS, which stands for Boycott, Divest, and Sanction. So the boycott of Israeli companies that make money from the occupation of the West Bank has been very successful. It's got a lot of international support, and it's got tremendous opposition here by the Israeli lobby and by certainly under the Trump administration, very aggressive legal steps to penalize colleges, for example, where student organizations may support BDS. So threats around federal funding. States have legislation where contractors must say that they will not boycott take part in the boycotting of Israel. And if they don't, they are dismissed, their contract is canceled. So very aggressive tactics, and it just tells you how powerful that BDS movement is and what kind of a threat that is to the military occupation. So yeah, we have a lot to say about what happens there. And one other, I think, update, and something that again has caused a lot of international outcry. We hear in the mainstream US media about what a great job Israel has done vaccinating its population. They're the most, they're the furthest along. They've got the most percentage of people vaccinated. But what doesn't get talked about is that Israel is an occupying power. They've occupied the West Bank and Gaza since '67. And according to international law, the Geneva Convention, an occupying power is responsible for the health of the people that they occupy. And yet no vaccines were provided for the Palestinian population at all by Israel. And so it's outrageous. The health systems, especially Gaza, have been very damaged. And yet, so Gaza is a very dense population. I think maybe the most dense in the world, one of the most dense places in the world. So you've got all these people that cannot physically distance, and yet their vaccines have not been provided or allowed, not been provided to them. And so there's it's a real unjust system. And so there's been international outcry about that. And the one thing that Israel did do in response to that pressure was they did vaccinate, I mentioned earlier, the 70,000 Palestinian laborers who cross over into Israel every day. So Israel has taken steps now to vaccinate those Palestinians that come and work in Israel. But if you don't come and work in Israel, if you don't come into direct contact with Israeli citizens, then you still don't get any vaccination from Israel. Now, international groups have stepped forward, and the Palestinian Authority has done what they can do within their limited means to acquire vaccines. So it is progressing, but it's much slower than what's happening in Israel. And it's another example of the injustice that's going on there. So again, we all have a responsibility to do what we can. It's why, I in particular have become involved, because I have some sense of responsibility being Jewish for what's being done in my name, essentially. Anything else, Beck, to add?
Could I make a comment?
Yeah, I'd like to hear comments, and questions would be really welcome.
Well, I'm glad you can hear me. I would turn the camera on if I know how.
And
How do I get back? Oh, well, there I am up there. If I click that, that doesn't work. Oh, wait.
okay, are you using you've muted yourself, so we can't hear you right now. If you are using a laptop.
Here I am. I'm back.
Can hear you.
I was just trying to make my image reappear, but I don't know how to do it.
I will send you a request. You'll see that now.
Maybe right here. I think, well, I'm not going to click that. I don't want to ruin anything, but.
If you click it, your video will turn on.
It'll what?
It will turn on.
Can you see my screen? This one right here? There I
Yes,
am.
we can.
There we see you.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hello.
I'm Dave Wendland. I live here in Vernon County. First of all, I really, really appreciate this little program.
Mhm.
I think about this situation every day because I follow alternative news, because I'm glad at the end there you tied in with the American media, which is totally complicit. They will never tell the truth about what's happening. Every time there's a skirmish or a little war or something, it's always couched in Palestinians shot rockets first. so they get cover, because then Israelis are only protecting themselves. Our own Senator Tammy Baldwin 2 years ago or so, during the last war where there was like 2,000 Palestinians killed, maybe 50 Israelis, when she commented about the fact that Israelis had bombed refugee centers and hospitals, she defended Israel in her statement, saying they have a right to defend themselves by bombing hospitals.
Mhm.
Both American parties are complicit in this, and you've touched on that too. That was going to be my main point. How is AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, how can they be that powerful? That they have the entire US Congress, and it doesn't matter who's in the White House. Joe Biden has already put the feelers out, or signaled that nothing's going to change with actually the Secretary of State did the other day, making cover, and also refusing, as always, to support the International Criminal Court, who wants to investigate war crimes against Israel.
Yeah.
Okay.
We always veto that.
Mm.
Lacey, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I had a thank you for your comments and for your question that you asked, Dave. Let's see if Bob and Becky want to address that question that you had asked them.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
power of the AIPAC lobby. How is it?
Yeah. Let's take some time to hear from them and see what their thoughts are on that, and also to remind as well that for the purposes of this program, to hear their experiences, and sometimes and perhaps some of these questions might be outside of their knowledge or specialty, but we can certainly have a discussion and hear about, we're really great and glad to hear from Bob and Becky about their journeys that they had in Palestine, but we'll see to what perspective and what scope that is appropriate to stay within here. So thank
Sure.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the question or the comment as well. So AIPAC, which is the American Israeli lobby, they are very influential. I think there's two parts to their influence. One is that not directly through AIPAC, but there's a whole array of PACs that donate money to campaigns that take their direction from AIPAC. So if AIPAC endorses certain candidates, if candidates come and speak at the AIPAC convention, then that signals these other PACs to provide donations to the campaign of those people. So money is a factor, but the other very important factor is that, and I mentioned this earlier, especially for Jews that are more in my generation or close to it, there's a very strong allegiance to Israel. It's a carryover from, the sense, the need for security coming off the Holocaust. And AIPAC has a voice that they can speak to Jewish Americans and influence the vote, right? So if AIPAC endorses a candidate, if AIPAC has communication channels to the American Jewish community, that's influential in terms of votes. So you have votes and you have money, those two factors. There is a movie called The Lobby. If you're interested in understanding more, like kind of the specific ways in which that lobby functions. It's a very good film.
Right. Thank you for your answer there, Bob. Let's see here. All right. I would like to mention that there are about 6 minutes of the program remaining here tonight. Also want to take a pause and again say thank you, Bob and Becky, and a round of applause for the time. And yeah, you guys a round of applause.
Good job.
Yeah, thank you for that and for the time and effort that you have taken to record the memories of your trip and to be able to put them into a presentable fashion for other people to learn from your experience. What an honorable thing to do. Thank you so much. And I really appreciated the concluding remarks that that you've both made, you know, and especially thinking about Bob and how, you know, we're talking about what further actions can be taken. You know, one of my takeaways from your presentation is that I oftentimes feel, or I felt impacted emotionally, you know, to hear about pretty clear and obvious unethical situations and scenarios that are happening. And so to feel that emotional impact and then to have an idea about what I can, what further action I can take as an individual. So thank you for pointing those things out. And to recap that as well, you know, you were talking about, you know, just really think through that the tax money that's being spent and is going to fund different actions that are happening there. So to really think about that. And then you mentioned the BDS.
Yes.
Yeah. Becky, you were commenting on some of the groups that have social media presences, which I think is absolutely appropriate to mention, and for people to use, if you do use social media, to use that, the power of that and the networking power of that to really connect to people that are living there and are living the experiences that you have seen. And so it was really, I think, very powerful to know too. Thank you. That's some of my closing comments and remarks for the both of you.
Thanks, Lacey.
Well, thank you so much for having us and for being here, Brett and Dave. Appreciate it.
Definitely.
I would just add one thing to
Please,
that,
yeah.
that I like part of I feel some of Dave's frustration too, where the you can contact your legislators, et cetera. I think we as a country and a people haven't come to terms with our own settler colonialism.
Sure, yeah.
And I do know that Vernon County Historical Museum apparently has some exhibit information about settler colonialism. I read in their newsletter in the local paper, and I haven't been there yet. I hope to, now that I'm vaccinated, visit soon. But I think that's something that we need to come to terms with, our own role. This land that we live on is the land of the Ho-Chunk, and coming to terms with that is difficult. That was part of my experience going to Palestine, was learning more about that. It's not easy to figure out what you do with that exactly, but learning and coming to terms is important. First step.
Yeah, I think learning and talking with people you know is a very, you know, important step in terms of people getting a different perspective than they might hear otherwise.
I completely agree with you. Completely. I learned so much from your program. Thank you. Let's see, are there any other closing remarks from the audience?
I just wanted to say, like, after learning about all this different kind of like BDS and learning through all these different organizations, like kind of just got like little framework pictures, a little stories, but like actually hearing like this experience with you going to go visit, knowing how the farms operate, how the water is separated, and like seeing that visual personification of like these stories and bringing it to life was, it really brought it to different terms for me. I wholeheartedly love this experience. It was super awesome.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
that's really good
definitely.
to hear.
I definitely hope that you keep up with doing it. And I try to get more people to come and watch this, but
Okay.
but it's all good. I'll tell them to watch the video later on.
But I like
Definitely.
too, if I could
Awesome.
say one more thing. Thank you for showing really up close the Palestinian people because I already knew that they were all beautiful for the most part. But when you show it up
Right.
close and you see the children and you see the farms and the sunshine
Mhm.
and the smiling faces, despite all that, let's say it's an apartheid regime.
Mm.
Despite all that those people are beautiful.
Yeah, and I mentioned a few of the Palestinian folks who are part of our local group. They are pretty consistent about what they want to communicate to people is that Palestinians are human beings like the rest of us. You know, they want to raise their family, they want to enjoy life, they want to
Be happy.
they want to be happy, they want to be productive, they want to, you know, do the things that you know are just part of being a human being. And so just to, I mean, it's not all, you know, it's not Hamas rockets. It's also not just being victims. You know, these are
Mhm.
they're people, they're human beings, they have rights. And we want to give voice to that.
Thank you. I think you very much did so in your program today. Very thorough and articulate. And even in that last part too, could you speak just briefly on your coalition and what are in some ways that people who have been watching this program or are watching from home, if they have any further interest, I can let them know that they are welcome to contact me here at the library. My name again is Lacey Sheldon. My email address is the letter L period Sheldon, SHELDON at WRLSWEB.org. If you have any further comments or questions, you're very welcome to send those in my direction so that I can move you along, move that along to appropriate places and network you in. But then Bob and Becky, if you have anything in addition to that that you'd like people to know about further contact information or a resource that they could look into.
Yeah, no, I think that would be great. You know, we're
Thank you.
communication through Lacey. We're primarily focused on doing educational work locally.
Great.
That's, you know, that's how we see we can help right now.
That's perfect. Absolutely. Again, thank you all so much and really quite an honor. Thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting, Lacey.
Absolutely. Thank you all for
Thank
being
you.
here.
Thank you
Love the
all.
library.
Nice to
Bob
meet
and Becky, thank you.
Great
Yeah.
time. Have a great time, y'all.
Goodbye, everyone.